Oh, hello. I don't like that this is in the past tense. Yeah, sorry guys, we fricked it. Look, we can't just worry about every meteor that hits the planet. It's probably nothing. Oh, that's a name. Yeah, there's not much I can add to this intro, I'm sorry. Look, it's Blaster Master, what can I say? And we're just gonna start right in there. Note that we have save slots this time. These text boxes may seem a bit superfluous for a little while, but don't worry, there's going to be a bigger use for them. Okay, if you played the original, you already know how this controls. Jumping, shooting, firing sub-weapons. The big difference in terms of the use of sub-weapons and whatever is that you now have a recharging energy meter instead of limited ammo for your sub-weapons. Which is kind of useful since there are a lot more sub-weapons in this version of Blaster Master. So maybe I should give a little background on this game. Blaster Master in Japan was originally a game called Chowakusei Senki Metafight or something like that, and for our purposes we're just going to call it Metafight from now on. And it involved a pilot named Kane Gardner using a tank called the Metal Attacker, developed by the Nora Science Station to fight Lord Goaz and the invaders from the Invem Star Cluster or something like that. But we don't really care about that. Most people don't care about Metafight. When it was localized over here as Blaster Master, it got the story of Jason Frudnik chasing his frog down a hole and finding a tank, and exploring the mysterious lost underground of the planet Earth. What makes Blaster Master unusual is how the English version of everything basically took over the entire property. So, as we're seeing, one of the other major gameplay aspects is the fact that you can actually get out of your tank and explore various other underground areas that your vehicle can't fit into, and these can give you various things like power-ups, maps, and so on. There are a lot more power-ups in this version of the game, there are a lot more special weapons, and powering up your gun doesn't just improve your regular gun power, it gives you different functionalities for your main weapons in the on-foot segments. Now, one of the things about this version of the game is that it's somewhat easier than the original NES version for a couple of reasons. The first is that there are actual save points and checkpoints, and you're not expected to complete a rather long and difficult game on a very limited number of lives and tries. The second is that in this game you have a lot more potential solutions to the problems that crop up as you're fighting your way through the game. So the difficulty doesn't really kind of pick up until about halfway through, and it's still never really as difficult as the original game was. And I think that's a bit of a blessing, because the original Blaster Master was almost hellishly hard, and Metafight itself was even harder. There are actually rooms that were in Metafight that were replaced in Blaster Master, and there was one especially nasty room in Metafight that was basically a game over factory. They've also added save points before every boss you're going to fight. So as you can see, our blaster has like normal shot, long range shot, piercing shot, wide shot, machine gun shot, and a shield that can reflect enemy bullets. Some of the boss rooms in this game are just gauntlets of normal enemies that you find in the region. As you can see, we still have our grenades, but they have limited ammo. There are a bunch more on-foot sub-weapons as well, and we're going to be using most of them. But another thing about this one is that there are also more bosses, and some different bosses than there were in the original Blaster Master or Metafight, or whichever one you prefer. And here's one of the most broken weapons in the game, which is Chain Lightning. You can only have one shot on the screen at a time, but if you hit an enemy with it, it hits all of the enemies with it. You also get a flamethrower, which has some environmental uses later on. By the way, I also appreciate that Inta Creates still felt that Jason Frudnik was a perfectly fine name for a protagonist. So, this game was originally released for the Switch, and later on came out for the PC. And it also received a sequel a couple of years later, Blaster Master Zero 2, and I will also be covering that game for a couple of reasons, some of which are really petty and have nothing to do with anything regarding completeness or quality generally, but rather because it allows me to say weird phrases and also show off my knowledge of obscure games that nobody cares about. So, why Blaster Master Zero over other platformers out there? Well, because Blaster Master is still a pretty unique sort of game. It's the only game with a vehicle section that I care about. And beyond that, Blaster Master has always felt really good to just play. There's just something really good about how these games feel and how they control. And what it just feels like is very specifically a really good Game Boy Advance game. I'm going to explain what I mean by that after I beat this boss. And I show off what happens when you get hit. The thing is, when you get hit in this game, you actually lose some of your gun power. Like, I've already lost 2 functionalities from, being an idiot. So I'm going to have to rely on lower weapons for the rest of this boss fight. It occurs to me I should have used the wide shot more in previous playthroughs, but sometimes I just do a dumb. These guys just drop destructible mines and rush across the screen. It shouldn't be a problem for anyone who has ever played a top-down game. And for beating the boss that uses landmines, we get landmines. It just makes sense. Now, what I mean when I say this feels like a really good Game Boy Advance game, well, it has good sprites, but it has 8-bit-ish music, and a really bright color palette, because this all comes together to make the general Game Boy Advance feel. Because the Game Boy had Super Nintendo graphics hardware, but no sound hardware, so sacrifices had to be sometimes made on music style and quality and so on. And the really bright color palette was to get yourself seen on a screen that had no built-in backlight. Oh yeah, the Thunder Shot is more powerful underwater. Outside of water, it just shoots a little lightning bolt downwards, but in water it does a spread shot of 3 lightning bolts. The thing is, there were games that didn't have a bright color palette for the Game Boy Advance, like Castlevania Circle of the Moon, and it was Konami's like, people don't need to see things when they're playing an action platformer. They'll get by. Another reason for Blaster Master is that even the remake went with the Blaster Master story of Jason's frog gets loose, Jason chases after her frog into the lost mutant underground of the Earth and all that. It fully embraces exactly how goofball the original was, and the sequel also embraces how goofball the original was. It is entirely complicit in continuing that anything goes feel of that 80s Nintendo video game plots. Kind of in the same way that Shovel Knight did. My favorite description of Shovel Knight was, "It's as good as you remember old games being." Not as good as old games were, as good as you remember them being. So, the weapon I'm using now is the Wave Gun, and it's the most overpowered weapon in this game. It uses the final block, so you'll probably lose it anytime you get hit. Hey, I remember you from the original. It fires basically as fast as you can mash, and I am going to demonstrate that here for all of y'all. Yeah, this boss wasn't even that hard in the original. It still shoots those mini brains and can create a shield of mini brains, but I disposed of it before it could do any of that. And hey, we powered up our tank gun. Because one of the big changes in Blaster Master Zero is that now there are some bosses that you fight with the tank. In the original, you fought all of the bosses on foot, but not in this version of the game. I don't know why they didn't have any tank bosses in the original, but I'm not going to second-guess Sunsoft. So now we're going to get a power-up that we couldn't get before because our gun was too weak. That wall monster, we couldn't even damage it with our previous gun. Okay, now that's clear, and here's our life extend. So now we're clear to head off to Area 2. Yeah, the map layout is largely the same as the original. So the first two areas are basically tutorial sections that teach you to do two things. First, the functions of your tank. This area, it's telling you to explore things. Explore things a lot. And it's advice you should take because this game has multiple endings. And if you want to get the good ending, you need to pick up all of the maps and all of the power-ups. You basically have to do the whole 100% the game sort of thing. There is no room for non-completionists in Blaster Master 01. I didn't actually use the lightning on my first playthrough through the game, but then I realized in practice that it's really useful for those little grub things in this area. I'm not even sure how much I used the tank special weapons in the original NES game when I played it then. So we got a new feature, which is the proximity detector, which tells us when we're going to the source of one of these signals that our tank picks up. You only have that active if you've turned the receiver on, I believe. I could be wrong. I'm not perfect at this game. Yeah, Chain Lightning just trivializes a lot of these horde enemies. I think that's the point. Yeah, this fight is trivial no matter how down on your luck you are. Because these enemies basically take no damage to kill. This isn't like some of the monster encounters later where you encounter enemies that you'd rather not fight in hordes. Even with the advantages that this version of the game gives you. Not much to say here besides that. And for that we get the homing missile. It does what homing missiles always do in these games. It lets you down. No, the homing missile is actually useful. I'd also like to note that we've already picked up all of the special weapons from the original Blaster Master, and we are not even a half hour into the game. One thing you may have noticed is that in this version there are also different functionalities for the main gun. In the original, you could only power up the main weapon. It didn't have any special abilities you could attach to it. But in this game, things are a bit different. This is very much an expanded version of the original Blaster Master in many ways. So, it's a really good game for if you want to have the Blaster Master experience without getting kicked in the teeth. The trick about the wave cannon, though, even though it's quite powerful, or can be quite powerful, is that for it to do its broken level of damage, you need to hit with all 3 of the shots that it spews out, and it spews wide. So you need to hit the enemy where the shots intersect or at point-blank range. One of the things about the top-down areas is that areas with bosses kick you back out to the main world after you beat them, but areas that just have things like the map, you have to get back out manually. And Jason just says the same thing here. Yeah, because of the more emphasis on exploration and finding power-ups and defeating all of the new bosses and stuff, Blaster Master Zero is kind of more of a Metroidvania almost than the original game. Well, it's not really Metroidvania, it's just a Metroid. I've made this distinction before. Basically, there's no experience advancement mechanic in Blaster Master Zero, so it's just a Metroid rather than something derived from the Igavanias or Metroidvanias or whatever you want to call them. I abuse the homing missile. It's just too useful to... It's just too useful not to. Considering how strong it is against the weaker enemies that can attack from awkward places. We're eventually going to find a better weapon for dealing with those grubs, but that's not for a while. The homing missile is about as weak as your main shot, but it can attack anything, and sometimes that's just enough. God, I sound like a Nintendo video guide or something. So, these rooms can flood with the purple goo, and if you've played NES games, you know that touching anything that can be called goo is bad. The thing is, any damage can drain your power meter. Not just damage from enemies, so environmental hazards represent a much stronger threat than you might normally expect. Because they sap your ability to deal with the other very violent, very mobile threats. Now I know that this is new. Yeah, I lost my overpowered gun, so I have to make do. And this is a charge attack for the main gun of our tank. It can shoot through walls, which will be very important. And I think that's good enough for now. I will be seeing you next time where we finish exploring this area. See you then!